In World War I, the French had a cannon so brutal it made headlines as merciless in 1914. A few years later, someone named a cocktail after it. And when you taste it, you'll understand why. But the story isn't as straightforward as it seems, because before the French 75 was a drink, it was a nickname. And when you ordered one in its early days, you weren't just sipping, you were bracing for impact. So welcome back to History in a Glass. I'm Josh, your guide in this tipsy time machine through history. Today we're diving into a drink that starts in the battlefield, stumbles into a smoky Paris bar, and a century later ends up on your brunch menu. A cocktail with cannon fire in its name and champagne in its veins. And since Bastille Day just passed on July 14th, it's a perfect time to raise a glass to French rebellion with something that hits just as hard, the French 75. The story, well, it's a little messy. You've got trench slang, cafes packed with expats, American bartenders hiding out in Europe, a mischievous prankster, and a recipe that took more than a decade to pin down. So, if you're ready, grab your gin, your lemons, and something French and bubbly. We're about to unpack artillery in a glass. A lot of cocktails get their names from either people or headlines. And a warning, please pardon my lack of French. In the early 20th century, the Canon des Soixante-Quinze Modèle 1897, better known by its nickname the 75 or the Soixante-Quinze, was a gun making waves. This French field gun was fast, accurate, and brutally efficient during World War I, earning the title of Merciless from the Chicago Tribune in 1914. Allied troops swore by it, Germans feared it. And of course, the legends followed. If you believe the stories, the French 75 drink was born in the trenches of the war. British soldiers, short on proper glassware, supposedly poured gin, lemon juice, sugar, and champagne into empty 75mm shell casings, and then passed them around like shared flasks. Now that's a hell of a visual, but there's no real evidence that happened. More likely it's one of those tales that stuck because it should be true. Still, by the middle of the war, the name had started turning up in bars. Not as a recipe, but as a warning. French 75 meant whatever drink hit you like artillery. If it knocked you back, it qualified. It was a name built on impact, and the ingredients, well, they came a bit later. The French 75 is a household name today, but it didn't start out that way. For over a decade, the drink drifted through different names and recipes. First it was the Soixante-Quinze, then the 75 cocktail, eventually the French 75, and what we now know as a crisp champagne cocktail began as something darker, stronger, and far less refined. In 1915, the Washington Herald ran a piece describing a drink called the Soixante-Quinze, reportedly brought back from the front by war correspondent E. Alexander Powell. It had equal parts gin, Applejack, and Grenadine with a dash of lemon juice. No champagne, no flute, just a sharp, blood-red mix meant to hit hard. One writer joked that after drinking one, he immediately paid his rent. So as you can see, this is a perfect example of the early version, meaning a drink that packed a punch. It wasn't a recipe yet, it was more of a reputation. In 1916, the drink popped up again. The Sphere described a Soixante-Quinze cocktail at Chiro American Bar as an agreeable blend of Calvados and other mysterious ingredients. As the war ended and Americans lingered in Paris, bartenders kept the name, but the recipe was still up for grabs. Around 1922, two versions of the drink started to show up in print. First, Belgian bartender Robert Vermeer published a recipe in Cocktails, How to Mix Them. He called it the 75 cocktail, and it used gin, Calvados, and Grenadine. Still, no champagne. The second came from Harry McElhone at Harry's New York bar in Paris. He offered his own take, Calvados and absinthe. In later editions of his book, he added a champagne version, but he wasn't the first to do it. At the time, bars like Harry's were packed with American expats drinking bootleg liquor and soaking up jazz. The name French 75 was still floating around, but the recipe at that point wasn't locked in yet. That credit goes to a cheeky 1927 satirical cocktail book called Here's How, and that was written by satirist Norman Hume Anthony under the name of Judge Jr. He finally gives us a drink that we recognize today: gin, lemon, sugar, champagne, served in a tall glass over cracked ice. That was the turning point. 3 years later, Harry Craddock locked it in. His Savoy cocktail book reprinted the formula almost word for word, and from there, it spread around the world like shrapnel, from Paris to London to New York. That didn't stop the improvising though. Cognac versions took hold in New Orleans, where locals preferred brandy. Some bartenders swapped gin for bourbon, which was known as the French 95. Others used vodka, which was the French 76, but the core stayed the same: spirit, citrus, sugar, bubbles. By then, the French 75 had finally settled down. It was no longer a nickname, it was an actual cocktail. If you've been following along on the channel, and hopefully you have, you know the goal here. We dig into the original cocktail recipes to get a literal taste of history. With the French 75, we got a rare opportunity. Not just one recipe, but two well-documented and wildly different takes. So today we're doing both, the early Soixante-Quinze version from 1915 and the first champagne-based version from 1927. We'll make them side by side to see just how far the blast radius really spread. So the 1950 Soixante-Quinze article in the Washington Herald was not really a written recipe, it just called for equal parts gin, Applejack, and Grenadine. So here's how I'm gonna build that today. We're gonna start off, as always, with the booze. We're gonna use 1 ounce of Beefeater gin, which is a classic London dry that would have felt familiar to drinkers in both England and Paris during World War I. We also need 1 ounce of Laird's bonded apple brandy, as it's the closest legal match to early American Applejack. It's strong, rustic, and 100 proof. We need 1 ounce of real Grenadine, and here I'm using Liquid Alchemist because it's made with real pomegranate juice. They definitely weren't using artificial syrup back then. And we also need a dash of lemon juice, and here I'm just gonna use about 1/4 of an ounce. So let's go ahead and build the 1915 Soixante-Quinze. Now you can combine all these ingredients into a shaker, add some ice, shake it, and then strain into a coupe. But I'm gonna mix this in the glass because most likely there was no ice on the front lines in 1915. In 1929, this version of the 75 drink was rebranded as the Tunney, named after the boxer Jean Tunney. It's nearly identical to earlier versions of the French 75. That tells us that this drink was already circulating under different names, depending on who was pouring or who was famous at the time. Let's give this a stir to combine. So once yours is mixed, you can strain it into a chilled coupe glass, but I'm gonna do something a little bit different. Now, while I don't have a spent 75mm shell, I do have a metal cup that I can use. So I'm just gonna go ahead and pour it into our julep cup. So our earliest version of the French 75 is complete. So let's go ahead and give the Soixante-Quinze a try. Cheers. This one definitely punches at first. The gin and the apple brandy hit together. It's warm, herbal, and a little funky. Definitely warms going down. The Grenadine kind of smooths it out a bit, but it is a little tart. So it's not sweet and you can barely taste the lemon in this at all. It's definitely unpolished and a little chaotic, but that's kind of the point. So this is the 75 in the early days, packing a punch. This is something around 24% ABV, and you can taste the fight in this one. All right, so now on to the 1927 French 75 from Here's How. This is the first written version that resembles something of today's French 75. Let's look at the recipe, starting with the booze. Here we'll need 3 ounces of gin. Now, the 1927 recipe calls for 2 jiggers of Gordon's, but that meant something very different back then. Prohibition-era Gordon's was a bold London dry gin around 47 to 50% ABV. Today's US version, well, it's only about 40% and much softer. It doesn't hold up in this drink. So Beefeater is a solid modern match. It's still 40% ABV, still classic London dry, and it should cut cleanly through the lemon and champagne, just like the 1920s Gordon's would have. We need 1.5 ounces of fresh lemon juice, a teaspoon of sugar, and then we'll top it off with chilled champagne. I'm using Vieux Clicquot because it's historically appropriate and widely available. Vieux was around long before the 1920s, and its brut style matches what you'd expect from a dry French champagne of that era. Sharp, crisp, and not too fruity. Yes, it's not exactly cheap, but it's solid. And if you want something more affordable, go for a Brut Cava or Cremant, just keep it dry. So let's build our original 1927 French 75. I'm gonna use a mixing glass here so we can combine our ingredients and also chill them. Early menus actually warned that the French 75 was not recommended for ladies. Not because it wasn't good, but because it hit too hard. Of course, by the 1930s, women were ordering them anyways. And by the 40s and 50s, it was a go-to for high society women in both France and the US. We'll go ahead and give this a stir. Now, we've already talked about some of the variants of the French 75. You got the French 95 with bourbon. There's actually a French 125 with cognac, the French 76 with vodka, and even a Mexican 55 with tequila and bitters. Swap the base spirit, keep the lemon and bubbles. It's basically a choose your own adventure with champagne. Now this recipe does call for a tall glass, not a champagne flute like we see today. We'll start off by adding some cracked ice to the glass. Next we'll strain into our glass. If this combo of gin, lemon, sugar, and bubbles feels familiar, that's because this is basically a Tom Collins. Just swap the soda water for champagne and brace yourself. It's the same bones, just a lot more bites. And then we'll top with our champagne. Okay, now this recipe does not call for a garnish, so with this, we are ready to taste our original French 75. Let's give it a try. Cheers. All right, so this is way more refined than the previous version. The citrus and the sugar come together and make this really bright and refreshing. It's clean. It's somewhat balanced. It's not quite as balanced as what you would see today if you order the French 75, but the champagne works really well with the citrus and it gives it some texture with the bubbles. And so yeah, all around, this is actually pretty good. So what did we learn today? Well, this drink started off as a weapon. In the trenches of World War I, French 75 meant power, speed, and precision. And when that name hit the bar scene, it kept that same energy. It didn't matter what was in the glass, as long as it hit hard. What we saw was a name passed around like a fuse. From gin and Applejack to Calvados and absinthe to champagne and citrus. It floated across borders, bars, and books until it finally landed in a glass that made sense. From there, the French 75 developed into the iconic drink we know today. No longer just a nickname, the cocktail refined into something sharp, bright, and celebratory. But underneath that sparkle, it's still a field gun. This is the real arc of the French 75. Born in a war, polished in a bar, and still going strong a century later. And with all the riffs out there on the French 75, I'd love to know what you put in yours. So please comment down below how you enjoy your French 75. Thanks for keeping history alive with me one sip at a time. Until next time, drink responsibly, or at least drink historically.